Hello everybody, my name is Hank Tong. I go by Tongho58. Today I'm going to talk about taking landscape pictures. This is part of my photography basics talk, a series of PowerPoint presentation with narration. Hope you enjoy it. First of all, I like to say no to 4 automatic modes. Auto modes, as we know, take the thinking out of taking pictures. Make it easy, right? Quick point and shoot. No need to think. No need to do anything. But in return, you have no or very little control of your pictures. What you want to do is take control. It's not hard to master the basics. Equipment for landscapes. In my opinion, the following are essential. First, you need to have a sturdy tripod, and you need to be bringing it, because leaving it at home is not going to help you. Now, if you are planning to take panorama type of pictures, you might want to consider having a leveling base with your tripod. What a leveling base does is it allows you to quickly level the camera. So when you take a series of pictures and later you stitch it either in camera or using post-processing software, you won't have to crop a whole lot because they don't line up. Okay. The next essential equipment is to have a remote control. The remote control allows you to set the shutter to take a picture without pushing on the camera, which in turn shake the camera, which in turn blurs the picture. And you need to have a neutral density filters, because what the filter does is to reduce the amount of light going into your camera and allows you to have longer exposure time. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. What you should have, not completely absolutely needed, but what you should have is to have polarizer filter. And the polarizer filter will reduce the glares and the reflections to the mirror surfaces like water, glasses, and stuff like that. You should have a flashlight, because most likely you're going to take a picture of the sunrise, for example, and that means you have to go to the location in the dark, set up your cameras in the dark, and you need a flashlight to see where you're going, number one, to see what to set on your camera equipment. Most likely you're going to be in the cold, so having gloves is very helpful. Most likely you're going to be in a wet environment, like for example if you want to wade out in the middle of the waterfall so that you can have a good vantage point. You would need to have waterproof boots, otherwise you're going to be very wet. Some case you need to have a timer and a calculator. Calculator allows you to calculate the amount of time exposure that you would need for a certain aperture setting and certain ISO setting for a given amount of light that you have. Okay, and if it's beyond 30 seconds that is allowable for your camera to calculate, then you need to use the bulb mode, and you need a timer so that you know when to stop exposing the camera to the light. Good camera set up for landscapes, and we talked about having sturdy tripods. So what you want to do is to set the camera on the tripod, right? And then you want to connect your remote control to the camera. Most of us use the remote control with the wire because it's a little bit better. Once you hook it up to the camera, you have a foolproof method of setting the shutter off. You know, a wireless remote control is more convenient, but sometimes it may not work. Remember, you kind of work in the dark. You don't want to be fumbling around. Now the remote control, if you forget to bring it, or if you don't have one, you can always use a camera self-timer to set it off, to minimize the camera shake. So remote control is not completely needed, but it's really convenient to have. I highly recommend it. Is a piece of essential equipment, as I mentioned before. Now, for most landscape pictures situation, you want to use a wide-angle lens. You want to capture as much information as possible. Okay. And during the setup, you may consider whether or not you need to install the filters or not. And you install it as needed. Now let's talk about the use of filters in landscape pictures. Now we kind of touched on sometimes you need to have a long exposure. Okay, the reason for that is you want to smooth out the water. You want to blur the water flow for, like say, a waterfall, for example. Or you want moving objects to disappear from view. You need to have long exposure. But in some cases, if there's too much light, you already set the ISO to the smallest value possible. You already set the aperture up to, like say, f16, which is the smallest opening you're willing to open it, the aperture up to. So you still have too much light. You need to use neutral density filter to reduce the amount of light so that you can have a longer exposure time. You also might be interested in using a polarized filter. We mentioned this before, to reduce the glares, the reflections off of the water surfaces or the glass. Like say if you're taking a glass building and you want to be able to see through it without too much reflection into your camera, polarized filter is highly desirable. In the case that the sun's already up and the sky area is just way too bright compared to the ground area, and most of the time the camera does not have enough dynamic range to handle the two cases. If you properly expose the sky, the ground would be too dark, and if you properly expose the ground, the sky is going to be blown out. So in that case, you could use the graduate filter to darken the sky area. And if you don't have graduate filter, no need to fear. You can consider exposing two frames. One properly exposed for the sky, the other one properly exposed for the ground. And in post-processing or in camera HDR, you can just merge them without the use of the filter. Okay, so setting the camera for landscapes. The first thing you might want to consider is to put the camera into a mirror lockup mode. And what it means is that you lock up the mirror. The mirror is used to funnel light from the lens to the viewfinder so that you can see what the camera sees. Okay, when you take a picture, the mirror is gonna lock up to allow the light to go through the lens to hit the camera sensor. And the mirror, when it go up like that, is gonna hit a certain mechanical stop. and it create enough vibration in the camera that in some case gonna blur your picture. So you want the mirror to be up and out of the way to minimize that shake. You want to use the M mode, and we talk about no auto modes. Or we can use the AV mode, which is a semi-automatic mode, where you can set the aperture value and then the camera set the rest. Okay, you want to set the aperture value to a high value to maximize the depth of field. And most of the time, depth of field is desirable. Very high depth of field is desirable, so you want to maximize it. So you want to set it to a high value, but no more than f16, because beyond f16 you have severe diffraction error that would cause the pictures to be more blurred than desired. And since you're gonna put it on a tripod, and most of the time you want the exposure time to be as long as possible, so there's no reason why you don't set the ISO to the smallest possible value of either 50 if your camera has it, or to 100, like most camera would have 100 as the minimum ISO value. You want to set the appropriate white balance. For landscape, usually that would mean cloudy white balance, but it doesn't necessarily be true in all cases. In my case, I shoot in RAW, so I just set it to auto white balance and I adjust it in post, so it doesn't really matter if you are shooting in RAW. The most important thing that you want to consider is to use live view, and you want to set the exposure simulation, enable that, because when you change the aperture and the ISO and the speed, you get to see what your picture is going to look like through live view. It's very convenient to have a pretty good idea of what you're going to be dealing with your setting. Okay, the first consideration for a landscape picture would be consider taking the pictures at dawn and or dusk. Okay, after a while, I guarantee you will not want to take pictures of landscape at any other time, because the picture wouldn't look as good as the ones you take at dawn or dusk. The light is diffused, the color is really beautiful. Another consideration would be you want to take a picture before and after the storms, because that's just when you have a lot of clouds and the sky is dramatic looking. The clouds are great, a lot of clouds, dramatic clouds. And for example, in this picture I even got part of a rainbow in the picture. This was taken right after the rain. Now, as we mentioned before, taking a landscape picture, most of the time we use wide-angle lens. One side effect of having wide-angle lens is like if you are at eye level standing, the foreground is really muted by the nature of the wide-angle focal lengths. So in order to accentuate the foreground, which is many cases very desirable, you want to get your camera as low to the ground as possible. In this picture, as an example, I'm taking pictures of the poppies, California poppies flowers, and there's only a small patch of poppies in reality. So in this case, I get the camera down to a couple inches off of the ground and shooting up, and the result, the foreground is totally accentuated to the point that you think there's like the whole huge field of poppies, but in reality, there's a pretty small patch, as a matter of fact. So you can use that, to increase the effect. Now we talked about the use of ND filter, and we use the ND filter so that we can have very low speed. We're talking about milliseconds up to minutes worth of shutter speed, so that we can smooth out the moving water, like say in lakes, oceans, and waterfall. In this example, it was the ocean surface with about a foot chop, and this was 8-second exposure. As you can see that the surface of the water is fairly smooth, and if you expose it longer, it could be even smoother. In this one, I used the 10 stops neutral density filter to get this effect. The skies actually was pretty bright, and I would not be able to do 8-second exposure without the 10 times ND filter. Well, because of the, especially if you take a picture during the daytime, the effect of the sky is too bright, and so it's very hard to properly expose both the sky and the ground in this case. So besides the use of a graduated neutral density filter, another common technique would be to use exposure bracketing and or high dynamic range. Some cameras have a built-in high dynamic range function, where it would take 3 pictures and it would blend the exposure to give you a much higher dynamic range picture. That's why they call it HDR. Or you can just take exposure bracketing and take a series of pictures with different exposure, and then through the use of post-processing, like say in Photoshop, and you just merge those and improve the dynamic range of the picture. And I would say a majority of landscape pictures that you see today use this, either two of these techniques. Okay, like any pictures, not just a landscape picture, you need to consider the use of the rule of third in your composition. That doesn't change for a landscape picture, right? Also, what you always interested in doing in any pictures, not just landscape pictures, to lead the viewer eyes to the main subject of the picture. So a couple ways to do it. One of the main way to do it is to use lines, leading lines, or whatever method to lead the viewer's eyes to the place where you want the viewer to look. Similarly, you don't want any distraction that would direct the viewer's eyes away from the main topic. Alright? Okay. The last thing that we want to explore is the challenges that you would face while taking landscape pictures. Most likely you want to take pictures of sunrise. Most likely you're gonna be getting there to the location in darkness, and you would be setting up your equipment in the dark. So you got to consider having a flashlight or some sort of equipment so that you can see where you're going, and you can see the equipment so that you can set it up. Most of the landscape pictures are out in the wilderness, and it usually involve long hike. So you got to have the right equipment, the shoes, the clothing, so that you can do that. In many cases, you're going to be facing the rain, the cold, the wind, the sun, and the water, and insects, so that you have to be dressed appropriately for the environments, for the elements. The last but not least is you're going to have to deal with other photographers. Because when you get there, there will be other photographers vying for the perfect spot. So you kind of have to figure that into the scheme of things and try to be courteous and so on and so forth. Take this opportunity to talk a little bit about the setting up. Okay, when you get to location, the first instinct that most of us do would go to the places where there are existing photographers already, because we kind of tend to think that, hey, those guys got to know what they're doing, so they already pick a spot. I want to go to the same spot. I'm going to go find some place near the guys, and then I'm going to set up my equipment there. Now, that in many cases are true, but not always, because maybe you will be able to see something better. So the trick is, when you get to the location, what you want to do is, like, before you set up, you hold on to your camera, you kind of walked around looking through the viewfinder, through many different vantage points to make sure what you see in there. Then once you kind of form in your mind's eyes what you're gonna do and what what you're gonna take, what it's gonna look like, that is only when you're gonna set it up, your camera on a tripod and all of that. Okay, so remember to look, take a look, survey the area, take your time, don't rush, and your pictures will most likely be better. With that, I thank you for your attention and your time, and happy shooting.